Our Region's Business is sponsored by PNC for the achiever in us all, and by Fregasso Financial Advisors. How different could your life be? Fee-based investment management securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC. Our Region's Business. Innovation, transformation, momentum, improving our communities and driving technologies that will shape our region for generations. The collaboration that brings vitality, prosperity, and life to living. Stay with us for the coming half hour as we examine in depth our region's business. Now, here's your host, Bill Flanagan.
Today on Our Region's Business, paying the freight for higher education. We'll get some tips for parents on financial planning and find out about a homegrown company that services student loans and payment plans for colleges across the country. But first, the outcry over proposed state budget cuts to higher education. During his recent budget address, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Corbett proposed slashing state support by 50% for the 4 state-related universities, Penn State, Pitt, Temple, and Lincoln, and for the 14 state-owned universities. The depth of the proposed cuts came as a surprise to many across the Commonwealth. And university presidents are fighting back, seeking allies in the state legislature as the budget process moves forward. Mark Nordenberg is back with us today. He's chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome back. Good to see you.
Good morning, Bill. It's good to see you.
Tough circumstances. You've had a busy month since the governor made his budget address.
Yeah, we were surprised, as you said, by the stunning depth of the cuts, and so we have been off and running, making our case almost every day since then.
Well, I think a lot of folks in the nonprofit sector and government in Pennsylvania were expecting some reduction in funding given the state's budget issues, but were you expecting anything as dramatic as 50%?
Nothing like this. We all knew that it was going to be a difficult budget year. We all sympathize with the governor given the responsibilities that he has to fill that big budget gap, but these cuts were so deep and disproportionate and potentially damaging that they took us all by surprise.
Well, let's talk about the potential damage. I mean, University of Pittsburgh, great, big organization, billion-dollar university. What does this really mean to a university your size?
Well, it's a great big organization that serves an awful lot of people. And so one way to look at these cuts is that they are a retreat from the commitment made by Pennsylvania to its sons and daughters 45 years ago when the state-related university group expanded to include Pitt and Temple. The notion at the time was that all of the burdens of college education expense would not fall on families, but would be borne in part by the states, and that these universities would provide experiences at tuition levels considerably lower than private peer universities. And there are 150,000 Pennsylvania students enrolled in the state-related universities, by far the most of any sector in higher education. So the first impact will be felt by students and their families, because if you're not funded like a public university, it's hard to charge tuition like a public university.
And that state funding really has helped to keep the tuition at the Pitt and the Temple and Penn State lower than it otherwise would have been?
Well, our tuition today is about a third what would be charged by a peer private university. We're at about $14,000 a year, which isn't a small amount. But compared to $40,000 plus per year tuitions that you see at peer private universities, it really does make a difference.
You know, are other states more supportive, less supportive, doing the same thing that's happening here in Pennsylvania right now?
Well, what I would say is that support is declining in most states, but not nearly as rapidly and often from a very higher starting point. So in terms of universities that we consider to be our peers, often the state appropriation represents 20 to maybe even 30% of the total institutional budget. At Pitt, it's less than 10%, and obviously being slashed from there.
Now, there's some folks in Harrisburg who might say, okay, yeah, well, and all that may be true, but at the end of the day, this is a relatively small percentage of your total budget, and it's just a storm these universities have to weather somehow.
Well, but you need to think about what the components are of a budget for a university like ours, and you already alluded to it. Really, the research universities, particularly here in Pittsburgh, have become anchors for an economy that has really changed over the course of the last 20 years. Pitt, for example, now annually imports about $800 million in research support. That's about 40% of our budget. But none of those dollars can be converted from the research projects for which they were awarded to support, let's say, an undergraduate English class. And so the state appropriation, while it is less than 10% of our total budget, is more like 20% of the instructional budget. So when you begin talking about slashing that, it really can make a difference.
So what has to happen going forward? Obviously, you've been on the road. The presidents of the state universities have been on the road trying to convince the legislature to make some sort of change. I would think, you know, if we change course in the universities, the cuts potentially have to come someplace else.
Well, the governor's proposal, as he has said, is a starting point. Okay. And there is a process. It's a formal process that includes hearings. It's an informal process that includes discussions. As we travel along the road to a final budget, which hopefully will be fairer to the interests of higher education. And I should say, those are the interests of the region, too. As you well know, the eds and meds are playing a big role in driving the economy of this region today. I think there are a few things that former President Bush and President Obama agreed upon, but they all agreed that Pittsburgh was a model economy for the innovation economy of the new century. And we really have been playing a big role in driving that, so everyone's interests are tied to how strong we are moving forward.
Well, that's a good point. I doubt our region would have made it back out of the hole if we hadn't had 36 colleges and universities really making an enormous contribution. Well, a lot to think about, a lot at stake for our region and for the Commonwealth going forward. Mark Nordenberg from the University of Pittsburgh, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Next up, the prospect of higher tuition puts even more of a burden on parents to find a way to cover the cost of college. We'll talk about some strategies to help you get there. Stay with us.